Good morning, everyone. Today we will be talking about memory and the brain, and we'll be talking about some very important brain structures related to the use of memory and how memories are created. So to begin with, when we think about how the brain really works, we really do have to think about all the different parts of the brain that are very crucial and important to the functioning of a normal human cognitive processes. So we always look at the frontal lobe, at the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe as being very important contributors to the processing of information related to cognitive processes. Our occipital lobe is very important for visual processing information. Our temporal lobe is very important for language processing of information. Our frontal lobe is very important for processing associated with working memory and also with decisions related to specific tasks. And last, we see our parietal lobe that's generally related to sensations that we perceive based on temperature changes or vibrations that we may feel on our bodies. Now, with that in mind, it's very important for us to understand that with the parts of the brain, one of the things that we've always tried to do as scientists have always been able to try to understand where specific activities or specific actions take place within the brain. So, in other words, the idea of localization of functioning. Yet, one of the things that we find continuously is that we don't always actually find true localization of functioning, that we find that in this specific area of the brain we have exactly this specific activity or this specific process that takes place, but rather we have kind of a distributed function where the brain uses different parts of the brain at the same time to being able to do very similar tasks, this giving us a very good idea of how it is that the brain has evolved to being able to compensate for some of those particular issues. Now, in terms of the brain, related to memory, it's very important for us to be able to look at specific research studies that we would use to try to understand how it is that we would understand normal human processes related to memory and also abnormal processes related to memory. Now, we could use experiments using lesion studies on animals, for instance. We could also do case studies that we'll talk about a couple here, and where we have very specific cases of individuals who have already suffered brain damage, and we use them as standards for what it is that we would expect to happen to individuals if they suffered something that's very, very similar, or that they would have damage from birth related to those specific brain areas. And also we can use other types of observational techniques and use of scanning methods such as MRIs, fMRIs, PET scans, and also CAT scans in certain instances. So when we look at lesion studies, how is it that we actually do these lesion studies in animals? Generally, like I mentioned, we generally tend to do these types of lesion studies on animals because we never want to expose a human participant to any types of lesions that may be permanent damage to the individual, but rather we tend to do them with animal researchers or animal research subjects in those particular cases. And this is generally a technique that is used to actually find the importance of the different parts of the brain that function in comparison to the issues related to memory. So in other words, one of the things that researchers try to do is they try to understand specific issues related to specific areas of the brain that relate to memory, and also specific damages to specific areas of the brain. And depending on where the damage is, we should then be able to see some type of observational behavioral change in terms of their memory processes, in terms of the animal that it was lesioned, in terms of their brain, so that we would be able to identify what kind of response we would actually see out in the normal world in those particular instances. Now, we also see that case studies are very important for us in terms of the way that we try to understand memory research, because part of what we try to understand is how this actually happens in humans. Even though we may do some lesion studies related to animal research, it's not always something that's going to be transferable to human participants in those particular cases. But rather, we do always use animals as animal models for human behavior, but they may not always have 100% transferability or generalizability that we would see in terms of the results. So the best thing for us to do would be for us to be able to see how this would actually happen in normal individuals that we would see out in the population. But again, we're not going to actually perform any type of lesion on that individual, but rather we see any specific case studies that we may identify in the medical literature as individuals that we may be able to track across their lifespans to see how it was that they behaved prior to the surgeries based on reports from family members or even the individual themselves, and also how it is that the person behaves after the surgery may have taken place. And again, that being very important to us to being able to understand, because we want to understand the memory system as a whole. understand if there's any long-term memory implications, any explicit or declarative memories that may be faulty, any type of implicit memories, or any of the other types of memories that we're going to look at throughout the semester. How is it that we can try to identify what may have happened to those individuals in the particular case studies that we're wanting to evaluate, so that way we can understand what the behavioral changes may actually occur in the future and in individuals that we actually see out in the general population if they were to suffer something very similar. Now, two of the most important cases that we actually have related to the issues related to memory are the cases of Clive Waring and also the case of HM. Clive Waring was this individual who showed that he had actual damage to the hippocampus and some other of the frontal regions associated with the brain. He was suffering from both anterograde and retrograde amnesia, and this really gave us a lot of insight into how the biological foundations of different memory systems may actually function throughout the brain. So it's not just in one specific area that we have specific brain functioning or localization of functioning in those particular cases, but that we may have other distributed areas that may also be controlling other parts of memory processing. So in his particular case, for instance, that he lost some of the episodic and also some of the semantic memory, but in his implicit memory, that was still intact. Again, giving us this idea of that distributed memory system within our brain, giving us very important information. I have posted a video on YouTube for you guys to be able to watch of Clive Waring, so that way you guys have a little bit of a better general understanding of his particular case and how it actually relates to the issues related to memory in specific brain areas. And one of the things I will say is, it's sad to see an individual suffering with these types of memory disorders, but at the same time, it provides us as researchers and as scientists a great window of knowledge to being able to understand what actually happens to these individuals whenever it is that we may actually end up having damage in specific brain areas. Our last case here that we'll talk about is the case of HM. HM was an individual who suffered from very severe epilepsy, and when he actually went through surgery, part of his hippocampus and amygdala were actually removed. And one of the interesting things that we found related to HM was that he could actually recall earlier memories, but he could not actually form new memories. So in this particular case, HM actually suffered from what we would call anterograde amnesia, and I've also posted a video for you all on YouTube to be able to watch a little bit about HM's particular case. Now, with HM, one of the things that fascinated all of us within the research community was this idea of the hippocampus. For a very long time, we assumed that the hippocampus was where we stored memories, but in reality, that's not the case, because with the case of HM, it was able to really indicate for us that it's not necessarily where the memories were stored, because then that would mean that he wouldn't be able to recall any information either, not just not create any new information, but rather he was unable to create new episodic information. But one of the things that we did find with HM is that he could still maintain procedural memory intact. So he could still actually learn how to do specific procedures, even though he didn't remember or recall having learned that specific event, which was a very interesting thing for us to find within our research situations. So with our hippocampus, again, the case of HM was very important for us to being able to understand what the purpose of the hippocampus was, and looking at what the damage to the hippocampus may have potentially contributed to. And essentially, whenever it is that we find damage to the hippocampus, individuals can suffer from two different types of memory processes or memory deficiencies. One of them is what we call anterograde amnesia, which is our first one. This is where we have an inability to create new memories, as in the case of HM. And we can also see that individuals sometimes may suffer from what we call retrograde amnesia, where they have an inability to recall information. In the case of HM, this happened a little bit after his surgery, that he was unable to recall certain events a couple of months or a couple of years prior to the surgery, but after a couple of months and years went by, he was able to get those memories back, but he wasn't able to create any new memories related to that specific, after that specific surgery. Now, what are some other important structures that we actually see in the brain that may also contribute to issues related to memory? We see that the basal ganglia is very important for us, not just for motor functioning, as we generally tend to find with physiological psychology research, but we also find that it's very important for memory, for unconscious memory processes. So in other words, knowledge of habits such as idiosyncrasies or fidgeting that we may actually engage in, or even motor skills, having that knowledge that's not something that we're consciously aware of, but also making sure that we recall that information at appropriate times. We also see that the cerebellum is also very important for processes related to memory. It's not just important for complex motor control and coordination, but we also find that it's very important for procedural skills involving complex coordination and also for muscle control. So, for instance, whenever it is that we engage in walking behavior or running behavior, the cerebellum seems to be able to help you recall information in terms of how to actually do those specific tasks. Now, it's not something that you're going to be telling yourself, okay, now I have to remember how to run or now I have to remember how to walk, but rather it is something that you can be able to access that content and be able to use it whenever it is that you're in that kind of situation. We also find that the thalamus and the hypothalamus are very important parts of the brain, which are a part of the diencephalon, and part of the thalamus and the hypothalamus, part of their purpose is actually for memory for conscious and factual knowledge. So looking at how certain sequences of events are actually supposed to take place. So it's very important for us to understand how the thalamus and the hypothalamus actually relate to the issues of episodic memory and the aspects of declarative memory, and saying we actually recall specific information related to those events and the actual sequence of those events. That's very important for us. All right, so that wraps up our very brief discussion related to memory and the brain. One of the things I will leave you off with is I'll leave you off with this link for a video from PVC. I'll put this link and the other link to the HM video and also the other link to the Clive Waring video, so that way you guys are able to view a little bit more content and information related to these specific issues. And also make sure to read your book and also follow along with the information sheet that I've posted on Blackboard for you to know exactly what it is that you guys have due for this week.